Excellent. So as Mike mentioned, I'm Ruth Savinelli. I'm the Director of Operations for Presco Engineering in New Haven, Connecticut. I've been with Presco for the last 12 years, and I have been their Director of Operations for about 5 or 6 years now. And this is a presentation I prepared on behalf of what's going on with COVID-19 and our plan to transition back into the workplace slowly, but eventually back in. So as the state of Connecticut is opening up or beginning to open up during phase 1 today, we are also planning on how we're going to accommodate that phase 1 reopening and the measures we're taking to ensure the safety of our employees yet be productive. So this presentation will highlight phase 1 and a number of other topics that we covered during our training. So a little background on Presco. We're a New Haven, Connecticut-based product design contract manufacturing firm that serves customers in the analytical, life sciences, and diagnostics instrument industries. We've been in business for over 40 years, and we have electrical, software, mechanical, and optical engineers, as well as industrial designers and manufacturing technicians. These first 2 slides I'm going to briefly just go over. This was a disclaimer we put out to our employees, basically implying that if they were not comfortable with adhering to any of the standards that we were putting in place for our phase 1 transition, they have the option to opt out, which means they would have to continue working from home. So this was a little thing I wrote up that was pretty useful for us. And I'm not going to read through the whole thing. I'm going to be handing out these slides afterwards, so these will be available as well. And these were some of the guidelines we used for our presentation. Again, I'm not going to read through these. This is just so you have it in case you need it to use in other presentations as well. The first thing we did was we talked a little bit about how the virus spreads, and again, most people probably already know this information, so I'm not going to go into detail on how the virus is spread, but we really found it was important to give our employees a background of how the virus spreads so that when they are in the office, they're aware of the risks and also the steps they have to take to maintain a safe work environment. So we felt this was necessary to ensure that people were educated and able to make conscious decisions about their safety and the well-being of others based on these different factors. And again, these are all things that we have found online through research through the CDC and various other sites. So I'm not going to go into great detail on these. It's about transmission of the virus and different things. And there's some articles I have posted in my presentation that, again, you can read through as well once this is distributed. So when I developed this strategy, I started by writing up a Word document outlining the risk analysis that I would be using in order to really build the foundation of my plan. And I have a background in business. That's what I went to business school for. So I really took a pretty standardized approach to how I was going to analyze what was going on. I've been overseeing this effort since the beginning of COVID-19. So I had a pretty good idea of what would need to happen in order to get through phase 1 of this transition. So some of the factors that we took into account for the risk analysis were how many people should be allowed in the Presco facility at once, transmission of the virus amongst employees, loss of work inefficiency if infection occurs. In other words, we don't want to have 100% of our staff in the building at one time, so we want to limit the number of people here because if one person gets sick and the rest of the staff is exposed to the virus, then we would have to shut down essentially for a minimum of 2 weeks, which would result in catastrophic loss of income and efficiency in serving our clients. So we want to be careful on how many people are actually in the building at once. And some of the ways in which we plan to reduce the risk to employees, we're not able to fully eliminate that risk, but we're going to outline that through this presentation. And it will be published to you guys. This says Presco employees, but it'll be published to everyone here today. So some of the things we highlighted, basics, these have been published online. You can find some of these. Some of these were tailored for our needs and our environments, but prevention is important. Washing your hands regularly and thoroughly for at least 20 seconds each time. Again, that's according to the CDC guidelines. Practicing social distancing by maintaining a 6-foot distance or more from other people. So that's really important. Again, that goes back to how is the virus transmitted. And that goes in line with avoiding touching your eyes, your nose, your mouth, especially if you're touching frequently used surfaces. That's one of the ways in which the virus gets transmitted. If you're going to cough or sneeze, do that into a tissue and then dispose of the tissue. And some of the rules we have set in place, including staff members must stay home if they feel ill. And we've outlined some of the common symptoms of COVID. We are deeming a temperature of 99 or higher without acetaminophen or an NSAID to be a warning sign. The CDC says 100.4, but we have used 99 as our standard because a lot of people tend to run a little lower on their temperature. Some people run 96, 97. And if someone who normally runs 97 or 97.5 has a temperature of 99, it's generally an indication that there could be something that's going on, and we just want to be cognizant of that. A dry cough, shortness of breath, chills. Some of the less common symptoms are body aches, joint aches, headache, loss of taste and smell, diarrhea, or sore throat. We had a physician's assistant who is currently treating COVID patients. She actually wrote up a one-page overview of what she is seeing in the emergency room day to day. She happens to be a very good friend of mine. She's working out in Brockton, Mass. So she actually provided us with some of this data. So this is coming straight from someone who is actually working in the setting treating COVID patients. And one of the other things is to wear a face covering or a mask in public and at work. So we'll get more into the mask situation as well, but that's certainly become an important part of our strategy here. So some of the things we've done to prepare for phase one, we've been engaging in daily management meetings with our executive team to go over any changes that have taken place with relation to COVID-19 and the CDC and guidelines within Connecticut as well. So we've done a lot of research. We've consulted, as I mentioned before, a medical expert currently treating COVID patients. We've stocked up on cleaning supplies and paper goods so that when people do come back into the building, we're able to have cleaning supplies on hand rather than running into a shortage problem. We've also installed automated hand sanitizer dispensers throughout the facility, especially at the main entry points. We are also working to purchase automated soap dispensers. A lot of these things are out of stock, but we are working to get them through different distributors. We've also purchased masks and gloves for our employees. We have excess of those to make sure that if people forget their own face covering, we have extra to spare. And if they need to wear gloves for any given reason, we have those available to them in different sizes as well. We also purchased and delivered pulse oximeters to our employees. There have been numerous studies done on people who go to the emergency room, they're feeling a little sick, and they get their pulse ox taken, and it turns out that their O2 level rather is at 70 or 80, which is a major indication that they probably have pneumonia, and it might be too late, that they've caught the virus too late. So we wanted to basically give people the opportunity to take their pulse ox daily and kind of establish a baseline for themselves so that if there was a red flag, they would be aware of it in real time. We also purchased thermometers for our staff members who didn't have one at home, and we created an online portal for logging health stats. and I'll get more into that in a little while. And then we also bought signage to be posted in our building, just reminders to wash your hands, put on your mask, log your temperature, and pulse ox readings as well. So phase one, our duration will be a minimum of 1 month. And the factors affecting the duration of our phase one approach will be recommendations from the CDC, infection rates and hospitalization trends in Connecticut, state testing availability, and the ability to keep our employees safe. Management will continue to meet daily to discuss the risks to our staff, and the plan will be modified as necessary based on these management meetings. And employees will be notified via email or phone immediately if plan changes. So we've been sending out periodic emails to our staff to inform them of changes we've been making throughout this entire process. And we had started working from home around March 12th. So we've had a number of different iterations on the precautions that we're taking. And generally we communicate via email or phone to inform our staff of anything that's changing. So what are the there's a couple questions that popped up, so I just want to take a moment to answer those about the last slide. What are the references for use of oximeters? The guidance we've received is that one is probably already pretty ill before oxygen levels reach detection levels of an oximeter. So I'm going to get a little bit more into the reference for the oximeters, but yes, so one could be pretty ill before oxygen levels drop, but there has been some research done where people have gone into the hospital not even feeling that ill, and then realizing that they're already in advanced pneumonia by the time their oxygen levels are taken. So we are encouraging our employees to take a daily reading of their pulse ox so that if they notice that there's something happening, they're going to flag it sooner rather than later. It's not the end all be all. It may not catch the virus right as it starts, but at least if there is a real issue developing in the lungs, we might be able to catch it there. And the other thing is taking your temperature. The fever tends to be a really good indicator that something is not right as well. So I can get a little bit more into the oximeter references as well, but it's not the only data point we're using for that reason. So I'm going to move on to our next slide here. So some of the things we're going to be doing over the course of phase one, we're going to continue our work from home policy. People must continue to work from home as much as possible. If they have to come into the office, we are making certain exceptions, which we will get into. One of the main rules that we need to adhere to here is staying home if you feel sick. Even if you don't necessarily have a temperature yet, but you're not feeling right, you know your body is telling you something, stay home. The other rule that's really important is having one person in an office for the day. So that means if two people who share an office are in the Presco facility at the same time, only one person should use the shared office for the day. There's a number of reasons for that. One is high contact surfaces, and the other is transmission of the virus through the air. So there's not enough air exchange through the HVAC system on a given day in a small office to ensure that the air particulates are not remaining in the air for more than a few minutes. Generally, they've found that they can last up to a few hours in the air. So in order to alleviate or eliminate that risk, we're only allowing that one person in that shared office for that particular day. The other person should use a lab computer and remote into their desktop if they need to. All meetings, whether it be client or vendor meetings or in-person meetings for our staff, all of those are going to be held via Chime or WebEx. Chime is an Amazon platform, and nothing should be held in person. The other rule we've put in place is visitors. Any visitors from outside of our organization will be denied entrance to the building. If a visitor is deemed necessary by management, such as a utility company, or for instance, the other day we had our internet company here, permission for entrance has to be granted ahead of time by management. And then the approved visitor must adhere to all our safety protocols, and that includes wearing a mask and gloves while in the building. So that's very, very important. Travel, Presco won't be attending any trade shows in person for the remainder of 2020, and we'll be evaluating when we might be going back to trade shows, but that has yet to be determined. There's still a lot of uneasiness about that. And travel to client or vendor sites is prohibited unless the management team says, you know what, that's essential. We really can't get away without you going there. And that will only occur if management can reasonably ensure the safety of those who are traveling. So I'm going to take a moment here. There's another question that popped up. Any sanitization protocols for shared offices? Yes, we are going to get into that shortly here, and I'll discuss some of the cleaning protocols that we've put in place for the offices and the shared spaces. So another thing that people have been talking a lot about are mail and package deliveries and the risk of transmission through mail or packages, including cardboard and plastic packaging. And so we spent some time on this in our presentation because we handle a lot of mail here and a lot of incoming packages. So this was especially important in our environment. And for the mail, we've put in place that it must be received and quarantined in our production lab vestibule until 24 hours have passed. Our vestibule, as the word implies, is a separate little room that we have for receiving mail and packages that is locked to the outside world. In other words, our delivery guys can get in, but there's another door they would have to pass that's locked at all times before they can actually get into our environment. So they drop the packages and they leave, so there's no interaction there, and the packages or the mail can be left for that 24 hours. And gloves must be worn when handling the mail, even after 24 hours has passed. If waiting 24 hours to handle the mail is not possible for a management-approved reason, gloves must be worn when handling the mail in question. And the mail shouldn't be sprayed with any disinfectants or wipes, because generally that would destroy the mail packaging. In other words, if it's paper, we certainly don't want to spray it. We don't want to use wipes. And the other rules we have are to not distribute the mail to desks other than the front lobby until 24 hours have passed. So we don't want the person who's handling the mail to go around and throw things on people's desks, especially if that 24 hours hasn't passed. Once that's passed, we've said, okay, go put it on their desk, but people need to then disinfect the surfaces that the mail has touched. So we want to make sure that those frequently touched surfaces or where that mail has been is being disinfected. So the other thing is the incoming packages, and a lot of companies worry about this. For incoming packages, we want to quarantine them, again, in the production lab vestibule, on the production lab floor, or on our receiving shelf. And they shouldn't be handled for 24 hours. It's believed that the virus can live on cardboard for up to 24 hours. And on plastic, some studies have shown up to a week. So it's especially important that plastic packages, like sometimes Amazon ships in those plastic bags, must be handled with gloves and disinfected even after that 24-hour quarantine. And like I said, it's believed it can live on there for up to a week. And if you can't wait 24 hours to handle that package, sometimes people order things overnight. They really, really need it fast. Those packages, whether it be cardboard or plastic, should be disinfected prior to handling, and gloves must be worn when handling those packages. So it looks like we have another question that popped up, so I want to just address this quickly. We are exploring the safe use of UVC for its effectiveness to inactivate virus. Is this something you have explored too? Yes, it is actually something we have explored. We're looking pretty deeply into that. There's a lot of research out there about UVC sanitization, and there's some products that are better than others. But yes, we have done some pretty extensive research into that, and some of which I really can't get too deeply into. There's some confidentiality stuff there, but I think that's going to be a really important factor in inactivating the virus in these kind of office settings, whether it be your mail or other things that you're disinfecting. I think that's going to be an important thing that we're looking into in the future. So some of our cleaning procedures, I know this is a question that came in before. So on frequently touched shared surfaces, normal cleaning and disinfecting will happen 3 times a week by our cleaning personnel. So that's kind of our normal thing. We're not going to stop doing that. But what we're going to do is put a daily disinfecting protocol in place by an appointed person. Disinfecting tasks will be performed throughout the workday, depending on the type of the surface and the number of people in the building on any given day. Frequently touched shared surfaces include things like doorknobs, bathrooms, counters, the kitchen area, light switches, and a number of other things that we have deemed as frequently shared touched surfaces. And again, these things are going to vary by office space. We happen to have a list of about 20 to 30 areas that we consider high traffic, high risk. So we've outlined those in a separate document for our appointed person to pay attention to on a daily basis. And the frequency with which those shared surfaces will be cleaned or disinfected will be determined based on how many people are in the office, what the type of surface is, and the likelihood of that frequently touched surface being used a lot on any given day. So that'll kind of vary by what surface is being touched and how many people are here. So the other thing is the employee responsibility, which was asked before about disinfecting offices and how we're going to handle that. So employees will be responsible for keeping the labs, the shipping area, kitchen surfaces that they're touching while they're in the kitchen and office spaces sanitized after use. So if they're working in the lab or the shipping area, or they've just made their lunch, or they've used their office, they're going to need to sanitize the surfaces they've touched as well. So we all have to play a part here. It's a team effort, and the thought behind that is to help cover more bases more frequently by having the employees be responsible for some of their spaces that they're working in. And we'll provide the necessary supplies to adhere to these rules. So Presco, like I mentioned earlier, has purchased a stock of cleaning supplies, of disinfectants that we'll be using to clean these areas frequently. So phase 1, who is affected and how? As I mentioned earlier, we are making room for certain departments to be able to be in the building for various reasons. The teams that are affected internally are the engineering department, manufacturing, operations, and administrative. We started this phase 1 process on the week of May 11th, 2020 by allowing some of our manufacturing staff, which is an essential part of our business, according to the state of Connecticut, they've been allowed to be in on a more frequent schedule. Our engineering staff is allowed to come here for design reviews in groups up to 3, but that has to be pre-approved by management. The engineering staff can come in for lab work in groups of 2. Oftentimes our environment requires that our engineers are here to do lab work, and schedules will be maintained by management and modified if necessary. And what that means is we're keeping a group calendar that is updated daily with who will be in the office and when. And this is kind of our own version of contact tracing. The state of Connecticut is doing some contact tracing using a virtual platform, but we are using a calendar here. We're a small company, we're about 25 people. So generally it's pretty easy to maintain at this point. And that would allow us, and I'll get into this more in a slide or two, but it allows us to understand if someone's been infected, who was in the building that day, and were they exposed to an extent that would put them at risk for getting the virus. So I want to stop here for a minute. There's just a question that came up. So what assistance are you giving for home monitoring, e.g. temperature checking? Are you providing thermometers and oximeters? They've been in short supply because of demand. Good question. So we, as mentioned a little earlier, we did supply pulse oximeters to all of our employees and the contractors that we do have coming in the building who are considered staff. We also ordered extra thermometers in case people did not have thermometers at home. I'm going to get into this a little bit more down in a couple slides from now on other things we're doing to ensure that people have access to these supplies. So I will get into that a little bit more. And then there's another question that came up here. If you deny someone access due to concern for illness, do you pay them, exempt and non-exempt? So the state of Connecticut requires that if someone has COVID-19, there's a requirement that we pay them for 80 hours worth of time if they're out for a total of 2 weeks. And in our case, and this varies by company in terms of the exception, right? If the person hasn't actually been diagnosed with COVID-19 and they feel ill, our policy internally is that we're gonna give them that sick pay because we feel like that's not in their control. Everyone's in a pandemic, but I'm going to get into more of that information of what happens when someone feels ill and what are the policies we've put in place for testing and what they're supposed to do if that happens. So that's coming in the next slide or two as well. So we'll address that in more detail. So one of the things we're requiring, as mentioned before, self-monitoring health before entering the facility. Pulse oximeter and temperature readings must be completed at home. So that means those stats must be taken prior to the person getting in the building. And they're supposed to log their health stats into an online form that we have provided to our employees, where that form allows them to enter their email address, their temperature reading, their pulse reading, and their O2 stat, and whether or not they have a loss of taste and smell, because that tends to actually be one of the first signs that they're seeing in the emergency room that something is wrong, that the person has actually lost a sense of taste or smell. And so we're seeing that as an important factor to monitor as well. And that spreadsheet, it goes to a spreadsheet automatically that management oversees. It's confidential, no one else can see it. It's hidden from anyone outside of management. But again, if people are not comfortable doing any of this, they can opt out and work from home. So if a person does not take their test results, they won't be allowed to come into the facility. The red flags that we're looking for are an O2 stat of 93 or below. So what that means, the reason we chose 93 is because the pulse oximeters are generally good within a deviation of 2 degrees. So we said, okay, 93, if someone read it 93, there's a chance that their oxygen level is actually 95, because these are not perfect instruments. They are FDA approved, and we'll get more into that. But generally, if someone has an oxygen level of 95 or above, that's considered okay. Anything below 95 could be a red flag. But if you're someone who has COPD or you're a daily smoker, your O2 stat is going to tend to hover around 90 to 92. And anything below that for a COPD patient or someone who smokes daily is definitely a red flag. So for pulse readings, we're looking for something between 10 to 15% within your normal range. So if it's above 10 to 15% of your normal resting heart rate, that should be a red flag to you as well. And everyone's heart rate varies depending on, are you active in terms of exercising? Athletes tend to have a much lower resting heart rate. And when we say resting heart rate, if you've just come out inside from a run or you're, rushing around, wait a few minutes, sit down, and then take it. If you have a temperature of 99 or above, that's considered a red flag. Again, loss of taste and smell, and entry will be denied if any of the above occur until management deems it is safe to come to work. So when our employees log their health stat, they get a notification that says you are either approved to go in the building or you are not. They get an email that's sent immediately after they submit their form. And management is alerted that there's either an issue or there's not an issue. So we get an alert that says this person is okay to be in the building or they're not okay. Another question that came in, what provisions have you had to make for managing protected health information? That's a good question. So we did a lot of research into this. One of the provisions is that we've limited the viewing audience to management only for these health stats. We are allowed to ask people for that information because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But again, that information is in a secure file that only management can access, and it can't be distributed in any way. So we've put some protections on that sheet to ensure that no one else can see that information. So that's kind of what we're doing internally to ensure that. But again, we have let people know prior to getting into this presentation that if they're uncomfortable with providing those stats and having management given access to those, they can opt out of that. So that's one of the provisions. If they don't feel like that's okay with them, then they have the option to opt out. And there's no punishment for that in any way. It just means that they're going to have to work from home, and it's just a safer way to go about that. This spreadsheet, the reason management has access to it is because if there are any issues or trends that we're seeing, someone has a pulse of 60 one day and it's 95 the next day, we kind of want to know that there's something going on, even though that's not outside of the range of normal necessarily. According to the CDC, it's not normal for that person. So we want to have some idea of, you know, that person's baseline in a way. So what happens if you forget to take your pulse ox and temperature at home? So this goes back to one of the questions that was asked. What are we doing to provide access to this equipment? Presco has an available supply of pulse oximeters and thermometers in our facility, but they shouldn't be relied on for daily use. They're only there if someone has forgotten to take their readings at home. So one of the things we've done to ensure that people don't forget is that when they walk in the door, there's a sign that says, hey, temperature check and pulse ox readings are required. Don't go any further until you have done that. So just in case they've forgotten at home, we have a sign, and then we have pulse oximeters, thermometers at 2 main entrances, along with gloves and wipes and hand sanitizer to ensure that those people who are coming in the building, we're limiting the entry points to 2 entry points for the time being, so that if they do forget, they're reminded and they can do that right at the entry, and they can log in on their phone to enter their information in the form we have provided. It's a link, electronic link, so they can do it right from their phone and submit it, so they don't have to walk to their desk and risk exposing people if they have an anomaly. So that's really important. And the pulse oximeters and thermometers, they need to be wiped down after they're used. The other thing we're doing is face coverings and masks have to be worn at all times in the facility unless you're working in a single person office. So the moment you walk into the door to the moment you leave, any of the shared spaces in the facility, you must have a face covering or a mask on. And if you're in your office alone or a cubicle that's totally separated from other people, then the face mask doesn't have to be on. But social distancing should still be practiced even when the face mask or the face covering is being worn. That's important still. So whenever that's feasible, that should still be practiced. Gloves should be worn in the lab when feasible. Gloves must be worn in our shipping area. And wash your hands frequently according to the CDC recommendations. Hand sanitizer is available throughout the building. We have automated dispensers that we installed right when this whole thing started so that people can get hand sanitizer without having to touch a surface that's being touched by others. And then the other thing is to wipe down frequently used shared surfaces after use. So those are just some of the precautions we're taking during phase 1. And this goes back to one of the other questions. What happens if someone feels ill or contracts COVID-19? So if you are feeling ill, have not been diagnosed with COVID-19, and have been in contact with other employees, contact Presco management immediately. So if someone is feeling ill, they need to contact management, which includes myself and 4 other people. So they can do that via phone or email, preferably phone if it's kind of an emergent situation. Symptomatic employees will be required to get tested before being allowed back into the office. And then below, we'll get into what happens if an employee has tested positive. But again, this is another thing. If people are not okay with this rule, they can continue working from home. But if they have been in the office, they're feeling sick, we are requiring them to go get tested. And Connecticut has a number of rapid test stations, and CVS pharmacies are doing rapid testing all over Connecticut. So these tests are frequently given here now, and they're much easier to access than they were when this all started. And Presco management will then decide on quarantine measures based on the level of risk posed to exposed employees. So if this person comes to us and says, I have a cough, I have a fever, and all these different symptoms, but I haven't been tested yet, we need to then go back and see who is in the office that day, who is at risk for being exposed, and then quarantine. Those employees need to self-quarantine accordingly. So if a COVID-19 diagnosis has been confirmed, the sick employee must alert Presco management immediately. So if they have been in the office, they've been diagnosed with COVID-19, then we must get alerted immediately. Even if they haven't been in the office, you know, we're not telling people they have to call us, but if they haven't been in and they got COVID-19, it's a good idea for us to know that, so that if they email us and say, hey, I want to come to the office, we want to know that that person recently had COVID-19, because they need to test negative and have us, you know, be out for a certain number of days before we would consider having them come back in. But the sick employee must self-quarantine for 2 weeks or until the person is deemed safe to return to work by a medical professional. So we want to have that person cleared by a medical professional before they come back in. All employees who have had recent contact with the sick employee will be required to self-quarantine until management evaluates the extent of the exposure. So this is a case-by-case basis. If that employee was in the office, got COVID-19, the next day they were diagnosed, they were in the day before, what employees were exposed to them, to what extent, we're going to need to evaluate that. We want to understand how at risk each person is that was in the building with that person. Presco maintains a log of who's in the office daily. As such, management will inform all the necessary affected employees. So regardless, if we know that someone was diagnosed and they've been in contact with the employees who were in the office, we will inform those affected employees only, not the employees that were not in contact with them, who have been home the whole time. We're not going to go just spread this news to people who don't need to know it. It's for those who have been affected by the person who is sick. The facility will undergo special sanitization after we find out that someone's been diagnosed, and then management will decide when it is safe to return to the Presco facility based on input from medical professionals and the sick employee. I'm going to stop here. There's a couple of different questions. What definition of contact are you using? In Washington State is being defined as within 6 feet for greater than 10 minutes. So Mark, that's a great question. As we're going through this, we're handling this on a case-by-case basis. If that person certainly was within 6 feet of the infected person for more than 10 minutes, absolutely, it's absolutely critical that that person self-quarantine, and we'll probably recommend them getting tested. They should definitely talk to their doctor. And again, this is on a case-by-case basis. We really have to evaluate what the level of exposure to that infected employee was. If they passed him in the hallway but didn't even share the same, we have a 12,000 square foot building, and it's pretty segregated in the way that we have it set up. So it's not necessarily the case that some person in one side of the building would come in contact with the person in the other side. So if that's the case, there might be a very low risk of exposure if they weren't even in the same part of the building, didn't have any conversation that day. So again, it's a case-by-case basis. The second question that came in, are you specifying the tests that employees take, e.g. mRNA, antigen, antibody, high false negative with some tests? So there are a number of different tests that are available in the state of Connecticut. Right now, what we've discussed is having the rapid test. done. We have not talked about the antibody testing yet. I know there's still a high false negative rate with the antibody testing as well. And I don't know a whole lot about the antigen and mRNA testing. So basically, we're telling people, go talk to your doctor, go find a test station nearby, figure out what the best test to take is. We haven't actually had this happen yet where this was necessary. So we're kind of taking this as it comes as a team, and we'll learn as we go. We're going to learn a lot more as testing gets better and as availability gets better. That's going to determine, in many cases, what type of test we recommend and where to get that. So that's kind of in motion as we speak as well. So one of the big areas of high traffic areas is the kitchen. We're not allowing community gathering in the kitchen. That means if someone's in there, just wait your turn. Wash your hands before touching any surfaces in the kitchen. Wait to use the microwave until each employee is finished. Bring a cold lunch if possible, and if not, stagger lunch schedules for microwave usage. And when you're done using the kitchen, wipe down the surfaces that you've used while you were in there. That's just a way to keep you safe and others safe after you're done there. And then wash your hands before you leave the kitchen again. So kind of basic, but it's important to note here. And where to eat lunch. This is a big question we had from our employees because we're not a huge company, but we're in a rather large building. Again, if you're in an office alone and you haven't shared that office, you're not supposed to be sharing an office, but if you're deemed the person who is able to be in that office for the day, go ahead and eat your lunch in there. You can eat in your car. You know, it's getting warmer out, so throw on the air conditioner, open up the windows. It's kind of cool / warm here right now. Kind of an okay time for that. And if you're going to eat outside, make sure you're keeping a social distance of at least 6 feet if there's anyone else out there with you. So that's kind of the 3 different areas that we've approved for where to eat lunch. We definitely don't want people eating in the labs, which is not allowed anyways. We don't want them eating in common areas, sharing a table together. Just that's too close and too much touching of common surfaces. So we really want to be careful where people are actually eating their lunch. And my last slide here just gives a little overview of what phase 2 is going to look like. It's going to emulate phase 1 in a lot of ways, but we'll probably have a rotating schedule for employees to allow for 50% occupancy in the building. It's dependent on the same risk factors as phase 1. And management will meet daily to determine the effectiveness of phase 1 protocols and to discuss a possible phase 2 start date. So we'll be evaluating that regularly to determine when phase 2 would start. So there's one more question that came in. Are you using a general rule of thumb for defining density square foot per person for people in a given space? So we have some pretty large labs in our building. We are not using exact square footage to determine that, but basically our labs, which are much larger open spaces, we're trying to limit those to about 3 people. One of our labs is 1,600 square feet, and the other 2 are around 400 square feet. So they're about triple the size. The smaller ones are about triple the size of our office spaces. And the production lab, which is our 1,600 square foot space, is again much, much larger. That's almost 12 times the size of a regular office. So we're trying to limit those spaces to 3 people in the labs at any given time. The square footage we have taken into account. Those labs in some cases have taller ceilings to allow for better airflow. So we have taken those things into consideration, yes. We're not doing an exact science here. Again, we're a small team and we're only allowing very small groups of people into the building at any given time. Thank you for listening to my presentation. I'm open for more questions if anyone has them. And again, thank you, Mike, for having me today. It was my pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.